Hey, how's it going, y'all? My name is Nick. Welcome back to our Let's Read of the Sympathizer. Today we're looking at chapter 21. First and foremost, just want to get this out of the way. I was completely wrong about things getting better. This chapter is infinitely worse than chapter 20 in terms of difficulty to read. Yeah, this one is super dark. This one is super tough to get through. We're gonna kind of do things a little bit differently today. We're gonna go through a little bit of a summary. We'll do our usual bare bones summary. We'll get into a play-by-play. There's not really a whole lot I want to explore with this one, to be honest with you. Not just for my own personal sanity, but for everyone's well-being, I think, emotional and mental well-being. So we're going to kind of skip through a little bit of a deep dive. This one is kind of self-explanatory, I want to say. And I think that because it's kind of a continuation of the events of chapter 20 and the fact that a lot of the stuff that we talked about in last episode's deep dive is still pretty relevant to this chapter. We'll just kind of use that as our deep dive for chapter 21 as well. With all that being said, though, let's get into our summary of chapter 21 of the Sympathizer. The Sympathizer, referred to in this chapter as the prisoner, is tortured by Mon, the commandant, and a third unknown doctor. The torture is relentless and causes the Sympathizer to recall events following the capture of the female communist agent that he and the Major apprehended. So like I said at the beginning, this chapter is kind of a doozy, honestly. The torture that I anticipated in the last chapter and kind of alluded to in the last episode is explored in really brutal detail in this chapter. If the last chapter was difficult to read, then this one I think was pretty much near impossible. I was almost positive that things would get better with this chapter, but I don't really think that I've been as woefully wrong since we started book club. To be honest with you, I don't think I've been as wrong about anything so far in the book as I was about the improvement of the Sympathizer situation following chapter 20. Another warning out ahead of the play-by-play for this week. Really graphic depictions of torture and sexual assault in this chapter. So, like I said in the last one, if that's something that might be difficult for you to stomach, then maybe skip this episode and just catch back up with us in chapter 22. With that out of the way, here is my play-by-play summary for the Sympathizer chapter 21. So right off rip, we get the perspective shift that I was also anticipating at the start of chapter 20, or I guess at the end of chapter 19 for the most part. We go from the Sympathizer narrating to a third-person perspective with the Sympathizer taking the moniker of the prisoner. The narrator begins with an exploration on the science of history and the onward march of time that will inevitably lead to the victory of the Communist Party. The narrator says, "Awaken peasants, workers, colonized." He urges on the oppressed to rise up against the shackles of capitalism and revolt. The Sympathizer's blindfold is removed to reveal a grid of fluorescent bulbs and an all-white room straight out of the CIA's playbook. Along with the baby-faced guard, there are 3 men positioned at the foot of the Sympathizer's mattress in the 3x5 room, all wearing white lab coats, surgical masks, and stainless steel goggles. The men begin their questioning by saying, "Who are you?" The Sympathizer considers the question, and with some self-loathing, he settles on referring to himself as one bad man. I decided to remove and omit the racial epithet that he actually uses in this segment, just for my own personal well-being. The man to the right asks, "Who are you?" And the Sympathizer reacts viciously, straining against his bonds until they burn his skin. He gets defensive and then depressed. He considers whether or not his sacrifices for the party will ever be honored or respected by the party. The commissar then asks, "What is your name?" And we once again dance around the sympathizer's real name. He forgets his American name, which is interesting because he gives it to him himself, but he's finally able to remember the name that his mother gave him. The commissar chastises him for his inability to correctly recall his name and invites the third man, the doctor, to inject him with the serum. The sympathizer fights against the injection, but is soothed by the doctor, who says that he will inject him one way or the other, and that fighting will only make things worse for him. The sympathizer requests the lights be turned down, but the commissar refuses. The commandant mentions that he has been living underground as a mole for too long and has become fundamentally blind. The doctor responds that, as men of science, they can never give up hope. He mentions that the patient must be kept awake until he can observe himself as someone else. He then points out a device in a brown leather satchel in the corner of the room, which the sympathizer immediately recognizes as a military field telephone. I think this is where we get the kind of explicit explanation of the perspective change. I think this is the doctor kind of letting the reader know why the perspective change is taking place and why we're kind of reading this from a different perspective than the sympathizer's own words, which is what we've been getting throughout the novel. The doctor then goes on to comment about the truth serum given to them by the Soviets. He mentions that the field telephone won't be used in the same way that the Americans used them during the war, stating that we don't torture, which I think is kind of funny. The doctor clips the wire to the sympathizer's toe, suggesting that they don't want to hurt the sympathizer, just provide enough stimuli to keep him awake. He holds up a watch and says that every time a minute passes, the field telephone will provide a brief spark to the end of the clip. The sympathizer fearfully recalls the victims he's seen attached to the field telephone and preemptively squirms against the phone receiving a call, remembering that by the 10th such call, the victim resembled a taxidermied animal, living and yet dead. When the second hand passes the 12 on the attached wristwatch, the sympathizer is startled but not agonized by the spark provided. The commandant, the doctor, and the baby-faced guard all leave the room, and the sympathizer realizes that Sonny and the major are standing in the corner of the room as the commissar takes a seat on a wooden chair. The commissar begins to question the sympathizer about a book they found in his quarters at the general's villa, the Kubark interrogation manual that Claude provided to the Republican secret police. The commissar mentions that everything he is experiencing is straight out of the CIA manual, and then begins to comment on the great powers and their contributions to the Vietnam War, stating that their struggle, meaning the sympathizer and Mon's struggle, is only a small part of their so-called Cold War. The sympathizer hallucinates Sonny and the major arguing in the corner, fighting to hear the sympathizer's responses to his interrogator. The sympathizer pleads for the lights to be turned off, and he contemplates the education that Claude provided to the Republican secret police regarding interrogation. He recalls Claude saying that the techniques are effective, even if you know the techniques and know that they're being done to you. The sympathizer considers his experience with interrogation, and at this point he begins to list the different methods employed and his mastery over each of them. He asks for the lights to be turned off once again, but he realizes that every time he asks, he's interacting with a different person. The baby-faced guard reattaches the wire to his finger, and soon after, a teenage guard is feeding him again, showing the disruption of the body's normal rhythms and schedules. Mon returns and asks how he is feeling, and the sympathizer says that he can't feel his body, but his mind feels everything. The commissar asks whether he's finally ready to remember what he's forgotten, and to the sympathizer's surprise, he actually does. This is kind of where things start to get incredibly bleak, so buckle in for this. Like I said, really terrible segment here, probably the least fun segment that I've had so far reading the book. Just really awful stuff. The sympathizer recalls a room that he refers to as the movie theater, which is an interrogation chamber that doubles as a movie theater when foreigners are visiting. He's asked to name an interrogation method, but can't choose between the various methods that they employed there. Sonny and the major make more comments, but the sympathizer's interrogation resumes, with Mon asking who was present in the movie theater with the sympathizer and the communist agent. Sympathizer mentions the major, 3 policemen, and Claude. He recalls the layout of the room and the agent, who we learn was one of Mon's couriers, bound naked to the table. The room was illuminated by overhead fluorescent lights with blackout curtains over the windows, and the sympathizer and the major sit in the corner of the room watching the misdeeds of the policeman. The sympathizer pleads with the major to stop the interrogation of the courier, but the major sits uncaring and sweaty. He asks the policeman to leave them alone for a few minutes, but they deny him, stating that the sympathizer just wants first dibs on the bound woman. The oldest policeman offers the sympathizer a Coke and advises him to wait on the sidelines. At this point, the three policemen brutally sexually assault the woman, taking their turns with her until they are all satisfied. And that's really all I'm choosing to say about this section. So if you want a deeper reading of this kind of episode, this segment, you'll have to more or less figure it out for yourself. The assault is explicitly described in the book, and it's incredibly difficult to read, which means that it's incredibly difficult to talk about, but it is definitely the most gut-wrenching sequence in the entire book. One that I really did not care to read for a second time, which is why I'm honestly just gonna kind of skip it. There's a segment at the end of the chapter with the sympathizer kind of imploring whoever his captors are to just let him sleep, and it's super interesting. So it's something that I kind of want to just read word for word. We haven't really done that too much over the last few chapters, just because of how bleak things have been in the last few chapters. But this segment, I think, is definitely worth reading. He says, "They were good students just like me," referring to the policeman. "They learned their lesson well, and so have I. So if you would please just turn off the lights, if you would just please turn off the telephone, if you would just stop calling me, if you would remember that the two of us were once and perhaps still are the best of friends, if you could see that I have nothing left to confess, if history's ship had taken a different tack, if I had become an accountant, if I had fallen in love with the right woman, if I had been a more virtuous lover, if my mother had been less of a mother, if my father had gone to save stoles in Algeria instead of here, if the commandant did not need to make me over, if my own people did not suspect me, if they saw me as one of them, if we forget our resentment, if we forgot revenge, if we acknowledge that we are all puppets in someone else's play, if we had not fought a war against each other, if some of us had not called ourselves nationalists or communists or capitalists or realists, if our bonzes had not incinerated themselves, if the Americans hadn't come to save us from ourselves, if we had not bought what they sold, if the Soviets had never called us comrades, if Mao had not sought to do the same, if the Japanese hadn't taught us the superiority of the yellow race, if the French had never sought to civilize us, if Ho Chi Minh had not been dialectical and Karl Marx not analytical, if the invisible hand of the market did not hold us by the scruffs of our necks, if the British had defeated the rebels of the New World, if the natives have simply said, hell no, on first seeing the white man, if our emperors and mandarins had not clashed among themselves, if the Chinese had never ruled us for 1,000 years, if they had used gunpowder for more than fireworks, if the Buddha had never lived, if the Bible had never been written, and Jesus Christ never sacrificed, if Adam and Eve still frolicked in the Garden of Eden, if the Dragon Lord and the Fairy Queen had not given birth to us, if the two of them had not parted ways, if 50 of their children had not followed their fairy mother to the mountains, if 50 more had not followed their dragon father to the sea, if Legend's Phoenix had truly soared from its own ashes rather than simply crashed and burned in our countryside, if there were no light and no word, if heaven and earth had never parted, if history had never happened, neither as farce nor as tragedy, if the serpent of language had not bitten me, if I had never been born, if my mother was never cleft, if you needed no more revisions, and if I saw no more of these visions, please, could you please just let me sleep? I think that that's probably one of the most powerful segments that we've gotten so far in the book, and it's just sensational writing. You know, it's something that I think is like career making shit. You know, it's spectacular stuff. It's so tough to it's tough to read, you know, regardless of the kind of brutal torture and sexual assault that happens throughout the book. I think, or throughout this chapter, I think that this section here is one of the most kind of unsettling segments that we get. Everything else is really, you know, diabolical and really horrible and all that other kind of stuff. That's, you know, but it's terrible in a way that's kind of tangible, where this feels so much more ethereal. It feels so much more kind of the lens is so wide here, and I think that the Sympathizer is he's cracking right now, and I think that this is kind of the perfect way to kind of showcase his descent, more or less. I think that he's pleading, he's trying his hardest to give the people that are torturing him what they want. And this is it's just really, really difficult to read. But this section in particular, I think, is it's some of the best that we've gotten in the book. So the chapter ends, and we're kind of left to ourselves to consider the depravity and trauma that the Sympathizer has successfully blocked out of his memory, only for it to be drawn back to the surface through the tried and true methods of American interrogation. Like I said, there's a lot more to this chapter than I kind of went through. As for the deep dive of this chapter, we kind of talked about the CIA methods of interrogation and how they're being employed with the Sympathizer in this situation right now. Last chapter, we kind of danced around it. Not really danced around it, but we kind of theorized that it was what was going on. But this chapter, we get kind of a confirmation that that's what Mon and the Commandant and the Doctor are kind of doing. They're employing the Kubark methods that they found in the General's Villa on the Sympathizer, but they're doing it their own way, so they're trying to improve upon the methods of the Americans, and it's really difficult to read. I'm excited to say that that's really all I've got for this chapter. Like I said, I skipped over a lot of stuff because of the kind of difficulty that I had reading it through the first time, and my more or less unwillingness to read through it a second time in order to write notes about it. So definitely go back if you're curious and if you're interested, I guess, in the sequence. It's super difficult to get through. It was super difficult for me. Yeah, it's written really well, and it's really dark, and it's important for the story, and it's important for the Sympathizer's kind of re-education, and it's important for the narrative, I think, but it is difficult to read, and therefore not something that I really want to talk about. Let me know what you thought about this chapter. Let me know if there's anything that I missed with this one. We're on chapter 21, so that means there's only 2 chapters left at this point. Like I said in a previous video, I think 19 maybe, I talked about wanting to kind of continue the book club. So if there's anything that you're interested in checking out, let me know. And I've got some stuff that I'm considering doing. But yeah, if you've got anything you're dying to go through, give me a shout, and we'll consider it. Okay, I think that's all I've got for this time. Thank you so much for sticking through this one. Really tough one, not a good time. I feel confident saying that the next chapter is going to be better than this one, because there's literally nowhere to go but up from here. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.